Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into something really important, I think. We're looking at sources that give this deeply personal view, one that really shifts how we talk about autistic experience.
Absolutely. It's about moving beyond, the focus just on childhood management compliance.
Right, and getting into adult vitality,
Yeah.
sensuality, and maybe even a different kind of knowledge.
Exactly. It's a necessary shift. The sources today, they're really exploring how the body remembers, how it knows things that, well, frankly, traditional neurotypical frameworks tend to ignore or even exclude.
So our goal here is to unpack two really powerful connected ideas from this perspective. First, this concept of consent as atmosphere, and second, the kind of knowledge system that comes from that, which the author calls sensory residue. It's about how deep feeling, embodied feeling, actually becomes a valid form of knowledge.
That's it. And this whole discussion really centers on how the artistic sensory system builds what the author terms embodied literacy. It's like the fundamental grammar of being an adult.
Which isn't usually taught, right?
Yeah, not at all. I mean, think about the typical plans we make, especially for autistic young people. You look at things like IEP transition plans, and they focus almost entirely on survival skills.
Like cooking, banking, getting around.
Precisely. Cooking, washing up, managing money, using transport, basic safety and function. But they just stop there. There's rarely, if ever, a roadmap offered for things like vitality or intimacy or real self-discovery.
And the sources suggest this isn't just an accident, it's more systemic.
It really is. The sources get right into the implications of this kind of exclusion. They mention research on epistemic exclusion, basically, the systematic silencing of autistic adults when it comes to producing knowledge about autism itself.
So if we only study kids,
We end up fixated on early behaviors, yeah. And other work reinforces this idea that autism gets culturally stuck in childhood, making the complex reality of an autistic adult almost, well, invisible to the mainstream. So this piece, by tackling adult themes like sensuality and agency, it feels like a quiet but really radical pushback against that silence.
Okay, so let's unpack that first major concept then. Consent as atmosphere. The author starts this off describing wandering around San Francisco. Larkin, Turk, the Tenderloin. Sort of learning embodiment on their own terms, without a guide or a set script.
Yeah, and that setting is so important. It's a place operating, you could say, outside the usual, more rigid social rules. The communication happening there wasn't formal language.
What was it then?
It was glances, inflections, the way someone held their shoulder, maybe the tilt of a hat, little brushes of contact, too intentional, curious, but crucially non-presuming.
And that's where the big insight comes.
Yeah.
It's completely different from the verbal agreement model we're usually taught. The author realizes consent wasn't a policy to follow or some checklist to tick off beforehand.
Right.
It was an atmosphere, a kind of mutual awareness of being near each other, a felt sense of the shared space. And the care between people was described as the quiet architecture holding everything upright.
Let's just pause on that phrase. Care as architecture. It's powerful, isn't it? It implies safety wasn't this external thing provided by rules. It was generated organically through people just being present and perceiving each other without judgment.
So even in a place may be seen as risky or unpredictable.
Exactly. Even there, the author found that mutual respect built this kind of durable, almost protective structure. It was woven into the interactions themselves.
Okay, and this experience then leads directly into the second key idea, which feels just as deep. Sensory residue. If consent and safety are atmospheric, what's left behind after the interaction?
Well, it's the feeling that remains, not necessarily a sharp memory or image. Sensory residue is described as this deep, resonant hum of recognition that lingers in the body long after a touch or a moment has passed.
Yeah.
It's like cellular feedback, the trace that a moment leaves when, maybe language couldn't quite capture it or define it at the time. And importantly, this residue, this knowing, often arrives later, sometimes hours or even days later, once the initial sensory input, the noise, has settled down.
So it's definitely not just nostalgia or simple memory. It sounds more like data that gets stored directly in the nervous system, a form of knowledge.
That's a good way to put it. The author talks about feeling this charged curiosity early on and this sense of being recognized by the world before they even fully recognize themselves. And in that context, they felt that strangeness was not a liability but a dialect.
Wow, strangeness as a dialect. That implies it's just a different way of communicating, not a flaw.
Precisely. They weren't broken or wrong. They were just perceiving and expressing using a different system, a different language. And this early collection of sensory residue becomes the groundwork for their whole embodied literacy.
Right. Okay, so let's take that foundation, this atmospheric consent, this sensory residue, and contrast it with how intimacy is usually portrayed in our culture. The source makes a really sharp distinction here.
Oh, absolutely. The author contrasts their lived reality with the kind of intimacy often shown, say, in pornography or based on strict dating scripts. In those versions, pleasure often gets reduced to performance, linearity, and control.
Performance, like hitting certain marks.
Yeah, like stamina, choreography, reaching expected milestones in a set, predictable sequence. The source is pretty blunt. This model just wasn't designed for bodies like the authors, bodies with fundamentally different sensory processing, different thresholds.
I can see how that would create conflict. If your system is built to take in the whole atmosphere at once, trying to force it into a step-by-step performance must feel, well, terrifying.
And that's exactly the word used, panic, immediate panic. When the author first tried to engage with intimacy in that conventional way, the source says it wasn't about fear of the other person. It was this overwhelming avalanche of raw sensory input.
Everything amplified.
Everything. Every sound, a breath, the heartbeat, the slide of fabric became intensely loud until meaning just collapsed. The body might register pleasure signals, but the sheer volume of the input overwhelms the system, making the mind interpret it all as danger.
So the body's trying to process this flood, but the only label it has handy is threat.
Pretty much. But the author's natural way of perceiving intimacy is the complete opposite of that rigid, linear script. They describe it using the metaphor of weather.
Weather. How so?
Like a low front of anticipation building, then maybe a sudden downpour of proximity. The air itself feels thick with meaning. The body's language here is described as tidal. It's felt deeply before it's consciously understood or named.
That's a very different image. Tidal, not linear.
Exactly. And this ties directly into the idea of Gestalt sensation, which runs parallel to concepts like Gestalt language processing, or GLP. Instead of information arriving bit by bit, sequentially, like words in a sentence.
It comes at once.
Right. Meaning arrives as a whole constellation all at once. Think about walking into a room. A sequential processor might hear words, see faces, note the lighting, and then deduce the mood. A Gestalt processor gets the entire mood instantly. The temperature, the collective scent, the rhythm of breathing, the quality of the light, everything as one unified impression.
And then the mind has to sort of unpack it later.
Yes, untangle the different strands afterwards to figure out why it feels that way. So in intimacy, this means the body receives the whole context, the safety level, the rhythm, the tone, first and foremost.
That completely reframes the experience. And the author sums up this difference so powerfully. They say, for neurotypicals, language precedes touch. For me, touch is language, the first syntax of safety and the first poem of consent.
Just, wow. Let's hold on to that.
Yeah.
Touch is the first syntax. If touch is the language, the first grammar, it flips the whole script on deficit models, doesn't it?
It really does.
It suggests the body is the primary processor, the first philosopher, perceiving and organizing meaning faster and maybe more reliably than the analytical mind can keep up with. It's a form of understanding that doesn't need external verbal validation first.
And you can see the author learning this fluency over time. They talk about moving from feeling fragile to understanding they actually had this unique fluency.
Yeah.
The body just knew things that the surrounding culture had no words for.
Yeah, and the turning point described in the sources. It was the first time intimacy didn't trigger that overwhelm. It happened with someone described as a gentle, queer, attentive fellow student.
And the difference was?
Touch unfolded as dialogue rather than demand. It was responsive, a back and forth, not a pre-written script to be performed.
Of dialogue without words. That sounds like what some researchers call embodied semiosis meaning-making, happening directly through the body, bypassing that immediate layer of cognitive analysis.
Exactly. And the environment for this was key. Those old San Francisco queer spaces are mentioned again, the clubs, the back rooms. The source stresses their importance.
Not just as places of freedom, but something else.
They weren't just about breaking rules, the source argues. They were spaces designed for communion, places where the usual, often rigid categories of identity and how people interact could sort of dissolve for a while. The lighting was deliberately kept low.
Which helps with sensory input, practically.
Right, it reduces visual overload. But it also dissolved sharp boundaries, allowing people to connect based on maybe pulse and presence and silhouette rather than labels.
Okay, I got the practical side. But what about the ethics? How did consent function in that kind of low-lit atmospheric setting?
Proximity itself, the sources say, became the language. Consent wasn't a one-time yes. It unfolded in tiny, observable increments. A step closer, a shared glance, a shift in posture. And crucially, it was always reversible, always alive, and being negotiated moment by moment.
That continuous negotiation sounds vital.
Especially for the author, given their background as a survivor, finding safety in spaces where your agency, your yes or no, is constantly being checked and renewed, not just assumed up front. That was revolutionary.
And this leads to that really important distinction the author makes. Safety in those rooms was not the absence of risk, it was the presence of respect.
Exactly. That atmosphere of respect allowed them to do their own kind of research. Research conducted, as the source puts it, borrowing from others in heartbeat and breath, learning through somatic feedback.
So knowledge wasn't in words, but in the change in air temperature, the subtle shift in someone's tone, the rhythm of their breathing. The body was building this internal library of trust cues.
Right. And because the understanding was embodied first, verbal dialogue became truly optional, not this obligatory hurdle you had to clear before connection could happen.
Okay, so if the body's building this archive, then sensation itself becomes a form of scholarship, doesn't it? What the mainstream might just call intuition.
For the author was literacy, learned literacy, learning to read the vibrations in a room, learning to gauge safety from the cadence of breath. And that sensory residue we talked about, it's explicitly framed not just as a feeling, but as data, as knowledge that persists beyond the moment and often clarifies itself later, gently, once the immediate sensory noise has faded.
So this intimate, personal sensory experience, does it connect to bigger systems?
It absolutely does. The source brings in the concept of colonial sensory norms. Think about it. Systems, often implicit, that define which ways of feeling and perceiving are considered normal or regulated, and which get labeled too much or disordered.
Like pressure to always be calm, composed, productive.
Exactly. These systems often push for moderation, for flattening out intense sensation into neat, manageable data points. It's a kind of colonization of perception itself, demanding conformity to a narrow band of sensory experience.
Wow. So living fully through your senses, especially if your senses work differently, that becomes political.
That's the argument. The author's sensory life isn't just how they live, it becomes praxis. It's a form of communication, yes, but also a refusal to be flattened or disappear into those restrictive norms. To live attentively, sensually, as an autistic person in a world demanding moderation that itself is framed as an insurgent act.
An act of resistance through perception.
Precisely. And the final archive, the most lasting record the author has of their travels. Places like Atlanta, Paris, Budapest. Isn't the visual memories, the faded photos, it's the residue that remains in the body. The remembered heat, the texture of a surface, the rhythm of a street, the pulse of a shared moment. That is the body's deep, truthful archive.
That really brings it all together. The ultimate translation here seems to be what gets dismissed by others as oversensitivity, the author reclaims as archive and literacy. The understanding is already there, living in the skin and the pulse, long before our theories or words can catch up. It suggests adulthood can be fluent in sensation. And maybe intelligence isn't just about output, but also about resonance, about how deeply we perceive.
Yeah, this whole deep dive really shows how that map of self-knowledge, the most reliable one perhaps, is written just beneath the surface. It's in texture, rhythm, atmosphere. We've explored how the body collects and translates meaning through this sensory residue, whether our conscious minds are ready to analyze it yet or not.
So the body knows first, before the mind puts words to it.
That seems to be the core takeaways. So for you listening, maybe the final thought to carry away is this. If we accept that our bodies are constantly translating meaning through this sensory residue, what quiet, maybe unverbalized data has your own system cataloged recently about safety, perhaps, or connection? Data your conscious mind hasn't quite had time to decode yet. What's the language humming beneath your everyday language?